Welcome to our first adventure together. I'd like to tell you about the time that everything was UI components and nothing hurt. So I'm James Zetlin. I'm the new front-end architect here at Magento. And I don't work on a specific product. Unlike a lot of the other orange badges that you see here, my job is still tech, but it is to coordinate best practices kind of across our product lines. I'm pretty new, both to the company and to the Magento community at large, 4 months now. So let me just say that it has been an extraordinary and humbling experience to be welcomed, both by my colleagues and by the community so warmly. So thank you for that. But you'll hear more about me later. You want to hear UI components? All right, we'll get right to it. UI components, quick intro for the novice, the veteran alike. Let's set the stage. UI components for the uninitiated. If you haven't heard about them, here's what they are. They're a modular system in Magento 2 for making and organizing user interfaces. The UI component system puts together the business logic, the current data, and all the front-end bits and pieces for a part of a UI, like a grid or a form. So let's continue the metaphor. The orchestra consists of the arranger, which is these XML documents that define and describe, and then the conductor, which is a JavaScript object system that runs in browser and helps to register and lay out the components, and then the players, which are the bits of code in PHP and XHTML and in JavaScript that actually implement the component's internals. And when you're making a new page in your site, you can express this whole concerto as one line. It's gorgeous, right? I actually made a syntax theme for the Imagine colors. It was a thing. The basic idea of the UI split up into these declared and interrelated components. It's meant to replace any other UI frameworks in Magento, and again, perhaps products cross-line over the long term. So that's the basics, right? But a lot of you know the basics. So here's the UI components for the initiated. If you already know Magento, I can tell you straight up, UI components are blocks done right. The block is a hugely successful concept in Magento, right? We all love it. It's analogous to a view model and some other systems. But a modern website needs a little bit more expansive concept than the block interface provides, one that acknowledges that total functionality kind of lives in the front end and the back end in concert. And UI components are that. They're taken over, and some concepts have made it to the front end. They're still admin HTML only for now, for those of you who are in the know. There are some concepts that have made it to front end, but we're going to talk about them in the context of this talk in admin HTML. You may have heard that before, right? You may have heard all this before. In fact, maybe you've seen some great talks about them. That's a Vitaly Korotin emoji if you can't see it. You may have read some GitHub issues. You may have read or written or interacted with some dev docs. You may have written some code. And if that describes you, then you might have some questions. You might even have some comments. Because there's kind of an elephant in the room, right? Ooh, sorry. Elephant in the room. Because they seem really complicated, I know. But let's talk about that. A lot of really skilled and well-respected members of the Magento developer community can attest to this, right? They do seem complicated. And maybe some parts of them just look so verbose and hard to use. But upon my review, I found that they're only just complicated enough. But what's painful is that there seems to be a lot of surface area to learn, and that's verbosity. It may be too verbose in places, but that's something we can continuously improve. Because the thing is, this happens because web development itself is really complex, right? We don't talk about this enough. Actually, some of us talk about this too much. But I'm going to talk about it now. Many systems hide the complexity. I'm not going to name names. But a lot of things that feel terse and simple and concise to us, they're actually hiding complexity that we're just so used to dealing with we don't think about it. UI components were written as a response to this hidden or unacknowledged complexity. So they are designed initially to reveal and surface the complexity that was hidden before. And once it's revealed, that complexity can be analyzed and organized. And I know no one likes dealing with complexity. Smart people alike, this is like Einstein said this. Einstein said everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Okay, I got to stop doing that. He didn't actually say that, right? It was attributed to him. It's one of those things where there's no proof that he said that. But he did say this, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience, which is a lot better, right? No, we've got work to do. We have to acknowledge complexity and then get it out of the way. So let's go ahead and attribute this to Albert Einstein and move on. See? They're complicated enough to work. They make you declare things that used to be implicit. But those things were never guaranteed. And we'll talk about them. We'll get to them in detail. I see UI components as the careful beginning of a great architecture. Because here are the steps I see from the places I've been to creating a great architecture. Understand the problem, and then reveal its complexity, and then organize it into higher level and digestible concepts. So yes, this is basic OOP principle, right? In short, we believe UI components is taking these steps, and we believe in UI components. So who's this guy who just dropped in to Magento to say so? Let me tell you a little bit about where I come from and why you should believe me. So I've been around a while. I've been doing web stuff for 13 years. And the last place I was at was PayPal, which is sort of a JavaScript everywhere world in dev. They rebuilt on top of JavaScript and Node.js their entire consumer front end, and they made a few frameworks and used a few frameworks, and it all kind of whizzes by, right? Probably because, like a lot of those web companies, they prioritize developer happiness. Anyway, before then, I cut my teeth on e-commerce. I was the lead front-end architect for the Mozu platform, which you've heard mentioned a couple times at Volusion. Mozu's been renamed. It was a SaaS platform for enterprise e-com. It was a competitor. It was a full microservice architecture, and I did the front-end initial stuff and then ended up maintaining a whole suite of developer tools to help people do their work. And in that, I kind of learned mostly that e-commerce is hard. So anyway, you're probably thinking, wait, you skipped right past developer happiness. Okay, we'll talk about it. Developer happiness. I have seen companies that emphasize this, and it's not just for hiring. It's because of a basic principle that developers are hard workers and should be happy, and because of the knowledge that happy people and people who are in their flow state are learning and picking up new systems and writing more reusable and useful and good code and making systems that are humane. So it's important for developers to be happy, and the way that we do it for front-end developers is giving them less to think about, because we're really just car mechanics. I don't want to think. We want the tools that we use to be discoverable, to show us kind of naturally how to use them. We want guidance in any form when that discoverability fails us. And we want immediate feedback from our computers on the changes that we make. This right here is a demonstration of the Webpack hot module replacement system. For those of you familiar, Webpack, for those of you unfamiliar, Webpack is a module bundler that has a great deal of momentum in the front-end community, an emerging standard. And one of its initial kind of killer features was that it had a subsystem where when you edited a particular file, it would maintain an in-memory tree and then update in place what you had done, whether that file is JavaScript or CSS. As you can see, it had multiple strategies, and it still does. You can write plugins for this system for all sorts of other systems. We know that the emotional brain responds to an event more quickly than the thinking brain. So this happiness that you experience when you're seeing this immediate feedback helps you to learn. That's important. Okay, you also were like, wait, e-commerce is hard? Right? It's easy for all of you, I assume. But it's really hard to do an e-commerce front end compared to others. And I've worked on login-based apps alone. But in an e-commerce front end, every system has to be extensible and modular. Right? Every system must be maintainable by the non-experts who will ultimately be administering what you've made. And SEO is still a priority, right? In a lot of systems, we don't care about that anymore. So you got to render on the server. But at the same time, your customers and your shoppers want to have an experience that's just like Facebook and any other app that has that rich experience. And so you also have to re-render on the client. And then the people using the admin UI are paid to use it. So they don't really have the right incentives to report back on what its usability is like. So incentives can be strange, and it gets really crazy. So I just come to it with some guiding principles. Software should be democratic. That's small d. It should be possible for anyone to learn, read, and write. Doesn't mean everyone can, but it should be possible. Common things that you do all the time, should be made to be easy. Things that are more rare should be as easy as possible. Things that are bad ideas should, if possible, be made to be hard. There's love in new things. Everyone jokes about the newest JavaScript framework. Talk to the people who are making some of those new JavaScript frameworks getting suddenly inundated by issues. They do it out of love because there ain't no other reason. There is love in these things. If you see a new tool, don't fear or dismiss it. It was made with a purpose and with love. There's also wisdom in old things, though. A code base that is old or legacy shouldn't be discarded because of that. It's in the wrong language, wrong paradigm. It consists of a bunch of accumulated wisdom about the problem domain. Lastly, I think even the most methodical among us You're not going to learn something if it takes too long to do. How's this talk doing on time, by the way? We good? All right. So let's talk about what front-end work in Magento was like before UI components so we can understand the problem domain that existed, that UI components were kind of developed in response to, so we can kind of see what they're meant to be. So there was a bunch of pieces to this in Magento 1 and in early revs of Magento 2, right? Merged layouts in XML, we all know. That's blocks and containers with different XML nodes representing the declarative or imperative instructions. And there's wisdom in old things here. Blocks are successful and popular because they can be joined together really simply. And then data providers let views declare their model needs rather than doing pure MVC. The actual markup is just plain PHTML files, like the 90s, which has some security issues, which means that it'll ultimately go away, but I recall it fondly because software should be democratic, right? And people should be able to do it easily. But of course, there are problems. In this regular layout language, there isn't really a relation between blocks of HTML, which declare particular nodes to be used, and then the resources which style and attach behavior to them, even though there is a dependency there. A block can say, oh, this is a resource that I require, but all it can really say is, here's a thing you should load because I exist. It doesn't really talk about how it interacts with the DOM at runtime. So the JavaScript runtime itself in a situation like this is kind of the old favorites. jQuery and jQuery UI, some utility libraries. You might see different strategies obtaining across different modules, because there isn't really a prescriptive architecture. It's just, you get a DOM node, you do some stuff to it, you attach some events, maybe someone puts it in a modal and screws it all up, and you stay late. A lot of homegrown tools that ultimately implemented common patterns that we saw in those systems. Mage utils, which did a lot of the same work that Underscore did, and then our own translation system. So a little duplication, but there's love in new things. So you have to look at each of these systems and say, I'm not going to throw this away. There was a problem it was built to solve. What was the reason at the time? And is that reason still good? So there's a lot to keep track of. Ultimately, despite the great improvements in Magento's architecture from systems prior to Magento with the blocks and the extensibility, the front ends of Magento's, and as much as any other system, has always suffered from the same issue. The markup and the CSS and the JavaScript are tightly bound to one another. And we like to pretend, because of our old semantic web mental programming, that doesn't have to be the case, but it isn't the case. Semantic web is not real anymore, and these things are tightly bound together. In Magento 2, making these front-end changes seems to require this huge, Magento 1 requires a huge continuous memory overhead in your brain. You got this tree of containers and blocks you got to keep in mind when you're working in a given context. And then you've got a parallel tree of the CSS classes, the current cascades, so you know which things can be applied. And then you've got a tree of JavaScript modules that are maintained by require, or in Magento 1, they're not even maintained by require, so you've just got some script tags to load. And you've got the possible override or removal of any of these files or modules to keep in your head. So each ingredient in a working web UI, and this is not particular to Magento, you've worked on other systems, you know this. It has its own little knot of implicit needs. So it goes. So what you always find yourself craving in these environments, especially if you have some CS background or if you've worked in other systems beside the web for building UIs, is you want some kind of functionality units. So yeah, self-contained units like that. And of course, everyone has thought of this. This is what Qt was. This is what the Amiga UI system was. And this is what React.js is and what web components are. So it's very generally a single tree of self-contained pieces of UI functionality. Each node just takes data, renders a view, emits events, and they're all loosely coupled and interchangeable because they have these defined inputs and outputs. They bind loosely to this exterior system and the data through your favorite flavor of mediator or facade, and everyone's happy all the time. This system is widely regarded as great. Hands up if it's something you've thought about, heard about, component architectures are good. No hands? All right, we're not doing that kind of audience? All right. I see some hands. I know that you've thought about it. I know that it's popular and common and good. But can it work on the web? I'm going to tell you a little story. I know that this is hard. It's harder than it looks. Remember that slide just like a couple moments ago that said they seem really complicated? What a weird slide. The UI component system actually works really hard to be composable and scalable. and analyzable. And that's really hard to do, and I think it succeeds. And we'll talk about how. When you fail at this, and you still try to build a component architecture, it goes a little something like this. Long ago, I had a dream of a similar architecture. Before Magento, before anything. And that dream turned into a different type of dream. I'm going to recall it to you, even though it's still painful for me. I thought, I've been debugging jQuery UI long enough, late at night. I'd love it if a functionality unit looked like this, with a little simple wrapper surrounding the back-end logic, supporting the unit. Say there's like a grid or a nav, that's the type of functionality unit there'd be. And then on top of the back-end logic, there'd be front-end logic that describes the layout and the skinning and the behavior and the effects. And the page is just like a page like this. It's just made of these. And then they're self-contained, right? And then they can get arranged to make a page, and they can nest, and so it's components all the way down. This was really the lovely part of the dream. It's really nice and peaceful and tranquil, but the web had different ideas. First of all, in the web, the back-end logic kind of sort of has to also produce a document to boot up the front-end logic, so it sort of pushes into areas of front-end concern, and it added a couple of extras. And then there's the front ends that needed more and more assets to support the more and more dynamic UIs that we were building, and it started to build and started to multiply, and then eventually it sort of becomes its own thing. You need it to be its own thing. These implicit dependencies kind of appear, and the front end replicates some logic here. It's a natural point of separation because there's HTTP between the server and the browser. The whole thing gets serialized through, and yet, through that HTTP layer with all the resources loading separately, there's these implicit dependencies that still hold. There's this logic, these assets. They can't work without each other. So let's optimize, let's bundle. Let's put all of the JavaScript and the CSS together with a little script that bundles it, so fantastic. And now all the dependencies are on these things. So, okay, now they're all kind of going here, but now wait. Oh no, there's common files that we're duplicating. So now we need a commons bundle. But the functionality units don't own the commons bundle, so who manages the commons bundle? And then the dependencies got so tangled. And then I woke up. This wasn't entirely my fault. Web pages are not naturally modular. They weren't built to be. The web is a technology that you kind of force these days to do what it shouldn't. Browser vendors and framework vendors and people like us work really hard to go against its grain. A small functionality unit needs a combo of server logic and client-side things. Any unit is going to be taken apart and put back together on the way, just like a Star Trek transporter or an IKEA flat pack. So it needs the instructions. It needs to be able to describe itself in a standard way that relates its assets together. So the JavaScript runtime needs to follow these descriptions when it loads up the components and binds nodes to each other. And, is this starting to remind you of anything? Yeah. UI components are made to fix this. And now we're back to the arranger and the conductor and the players and that lovely simple usage. You just need these extra declaration files and configuration files to describe those dependencies that earlier and worse, I'm just going to say it, worse systems left implicit. So there's one source of truth for dependencies. The component is the thing that really ought to know what it needs to survive. The XML picture here creates a container component named instant traffic, and it specifies that its config component property is this file name. So by convention, this means that the instant traffic JS file will receive a reference to the DOM node and be in charge of the life cycle of this DOM node. This is a common pattern. It's such a common pattern in UI components that we probably want to tighten up the expression of this in the XML, something we're working on, but we'll talk about that in a bit. The point is that the component itself knows where its logic lives. It's not a JavaScript file being specified in a view template like you have to do sometimes. Or the router needs to know all of the dependencies for everything that runs it. So, you know, it's all the logic, the PHP, the XML, the JavaScript for a UI component, they may have a different way they're supposed to bundle, but all the bundlers get the same tree of files and arguments. The PHP can be cached a certain way what it renders, the JavaScript be bundled a certain way, all based on the components and their dependencies expressed in one place. So a UI component takes this horrible dream and reveals a hidden order in the strands And then if everything is UI components, you could understand the components not just as the little boxes, but as little boxes in the small tree of dependencies that belongs to each one. Not so scary. It's like I turned the light on. I'm happy now. Functional programming architectures remind me of this sometimes. A really smart guy named Reginald Braithwaite described a system of successive higher and higher order abstractions as being a heuristic for designing good software systems. So you need many-to-many relationships between entities, but you simultaneously provide ways for programmers to intentionally limit, because of their own entity design, the ways that their entities can be connected. It's a good quote by a great mind. I think it applies in part to UI components. So with that to heart, I started to make one. Let's look quickly in practice. Let's add a small UI component to a Magento 2 admin. So first of all, we're going to add functionality to an admin products grid. It's a data action, which is a Magento UI concept. It's going to show a view of which of your products are currently being viewed live by your users. The actual exciting implementation of that part, well, it's a different component, and it involves a cool WebSocket, and it's too much for this demo, but well, that's kind of the point. We're going to implement the control interface for it in perfect isolation and declare a loose dependency on the implementation of the view. So we're going to allow a couple of options for the visualization, and we're not going to mess with anything else. And it's going to look a little something like this. You see we got a little extra action next to what you're used to seeing. Default view in the columns. Now you've got a thing called instant traffic, and I stole the export icon, and you got two different ways it can be viewed. And you can see that it's actually in highlight mode, and it's cool stuff like the messenger bag has clearly been viewed more and more recently. So you just make these files to make this. It's not that much. You've seen a couple of them before. Module XML and registration PHP are two-liners. So we won't talk about that one, but we will talk about this one. All right, this is the product listing XML that does this job. It overrides product listing, and it says the listing toolbar named listing top. There's a container named instant traffic, and it has this JavaScript constructor, and it links to this other component elsewhere in the tree, wherever it happens to be, that displays the visualization. It should receive this data at runtime. Done. And then there's an HTML template. And this is not PHTML. This is HTML. It happens to be a Knockout.js template. But I think it's important to remember the main thing is that it's a template that the JavaScript constructor will receive as text data. So you want to use a different template system? You can. And you can still follow our convention. Knockout templates, for what it's worth, I think they're nice. They don't conflict in symbols with PHTML, and we've made a few additions to the language because it's extensible. It's simple to learn, and it shouldn't take up too much of your headspace because it's not the core of what UI components are really about. And then here's the JavaScript that runs that template. Not too bad. Where's the template update, and where's the render logic, and where does it touch the DOM nodes? You get that for free. This handler just needs to implement a little simple configurator that changes up the config, and then observe the relevant property, and then just make a necessary change to the component that it receives from the global registry. And when the user makes a change, you get the rest for free from the component's JavaScript runtime. The runtime is soon going to be documented just as well as any first-class front-end rendering system like Angular, like Ember, like whatever. And right now, a big unsung thing about it is it gives you the encapsulation to accommodate this changing JavaScript landscape that you saw in all those twirling hexagons from my fourth slide or whatever. As that changes, you can use the same standard interface in the wild theoretical front-end land, keeps improving and optimizing the actual implementation of connecting your logic to client-side render flow. And these lateral relationships between other components, they exist too, because you have an escape hatch across the tree, the UI registry. So you can get another object that is addressed. We do that here, and then you can do something to it asynchronously without blocking render. So the main parts of the system are UI class, UI element, UI collection, and UI layout. And then there's even encapsulated inheritance via the UI class extend function. And all these components, they receive data through a standardized interface that reads it out of the init script, and then, sorry, what's that back there? I didn't hear you. You say, all that XML for just a bit of UI? Why did you say that to me? I'm talking. Yeah, what? Why did you shout that out at me? Fortunately, I'm prepared for your question. To reveal its complex dependencies, of course, we talked about this. In older front-end systems, these dependencies were still there. right? But they weren't enforced. And so that was concise. You could just say, this script, this stuff, go. It's 4 lines, and that makes it good. Do you remember how those apps would break all the time? The boilerplate sort of forces you to understand the dependency graph of what you're making across the server and the client. Hiding it's a bad idea. Bad ideas should be hard. I'm just saying. So, okay, I know what some of you are thinking. Yes, I have built these myself. And no, I did not always feel like the boilerplate and what I was doing was helping me to understand. So yeah, I think it's time to reckon with that. So let's do a little bit of reckoning. Here's some things I know that some of you have been dying to talk about. I think probably all my cheerleading sounds pretty pat, maybe even obnoxious, coming from this head in the clouds architect guy. You might be saying, like, is he just chiding us for complaining about his precious UI components? Is he telling me that UI components are hard because I am bad and I'm trying bad ideas? So the answer is maybe. I don't know you. You might have terrible ideas. I just got here, but you're probably fine. You know, I think the people trying to implement on top of UI components have really, really good feedback for us. We needed to talk about the ideal so we could measure our progress towards it. Because remember, a good architecture, right, must first understand the problem, and it must reveal its complexity. And then what's the third one? Nice. I heard you. We're not maybe going to put that all in black, though, because we're still working on organizing it into higher level concepts. We are. But this can be done foundationally. The process is incomplete, yet we have emerged. So let's look at the nuts and bolts and see what's missing. As a company maintaining a mostly open source system, I think we have an unusual relationship with transparency. We owe it to you, and we have to be transparent about things, but we also are working on things that we're very optimistic about. So this is an unusual line to walk. I think we should talk about them, though, just even though I'm relatively inexperienced. I know what they improve, because I saw it, and I've been in architectures that don't have this affordance, and I'm really happy that it exists. Because they improve the maintainability of your interface. The block overrides that we had, they created those implicit dependencies, and each implicit unseen requirement like that really multiplies the risk that your UI will break down. One JavaScript selector does not do what it's expected to do, throws an exception, and your whole synchronous thread is gone. So you have a lot of risk there with those implicit dependencies, and though UI components will evolve, it's going to maintain that assurance, and breaking changes ought to be rare. I think they're built as a pretty sturdy stack of abstractions, so we're going to build new levels upon it for maintainability, and the things that you made in the lower levels, they'll still be okay. And the analyzability of the interface is great too. Now, we already talked about how it can apply the same tree to the bundlers. Well, you could also maybe auto-generate your tests with the XML manifest that declares the UI components. The future is wide open for these. And I think that the modularity of the underlying implementation means that we may switch out Knockout, we may switch out some other stuff with some newer, faster system. We may keep it current, while you can simply express what your views are supposed to do. But what can be improved? So I'd say the first thing that we are carefully tracking, first thing that I have to say is the ergonomics have to improve. This XML right here expresses the data source that relates to a component. It contains more text than information. The physical act of reading and writing code is made much better or worse by the clarity of the code on the screen. We know this. This is reasonable XML in many ways. It needs types, and it needs a general notion of arguments. But it's too low level. As we learn what UI components want to be, a human only needs this information. Why not this? We have to find a way to get our XML to this point. We do. And there are reasons why this is hard to do. XSD validation is tough to kind of generate runtime and on the fly, and having nodes like this would make some of the components system less general. But it doesn't matter, because this must become more readable. That's more important than those other concerns, I think. What's another thing that can be improved? Well, I'd say the extension points are going to continuously be improved. They're definitely not at the point they'll be very soon, next couple of releases. The system is designed to be extensible, but extensibility does actually need to be implemented. This definition XML file where UI components get declared right now, right? You can't add new ones. So you have to use containers like we did in our example. Only the grid and the listing are top level. The JavaScript constructors are a little bit better, but they still use this non-standard class pipeline with the extend. And that has downsides too. ES6 classes are standard for what that's worth, but that's another talk for another time. That's just a tease. So Another thing that I think we all know ought to be improved, probably the thing that's the top of some of your minds, is just the documentation for all of this. Now, I know that when I read a narrative document that says, build this cool thing by taking these steps and don't ask questions till you're done, narrative docs help me to learn a thing. And then I go back and refer to the reference documentation to understand the API calls that I made and the surface area that's available to me. And so we need the full and complete reference docs as well. The DevDocs team does incredible work. I think there's people in the DevDocs team here. I think Tana's here. There's a lot more work to do. They and we know it. It's hard to maintain docs for a developing system like this. If you've met the DevDocs team, I think you're as confident as I am. And they're going to keep fighting to get it done and get it better. And speaking of things that are documented, another thing I think that could be improved is the error messages. I find that, oh no. Let's just go over here. Continuous improvement that we're going to do though, for sure. We're going to be improving Magento 2 UI components in 2 directions at once. And this is one advantage of the nature of their construction. We can add higher order abstractions, just like that extra XSD for the more tight XML nodes. We can add more configuration conventions. We can add file system-based conventions so you don't have to directly declare your constructors. Things can get more terse and concise in the way that you and me and folks who've made Rails apps kind of want to see. But at the same time, we can optimize the implementation layer, like I've been mentioning. The templates technology can change. The JavaScript technology can change because the render pipeline is abstracted away from you. And if you use them today, there's going to be a trade-off, but it's not maybe the one you're thinking. The early abstractions that we've made, like all those argument nodes, I think they're more verbose, perhaps, and they're less complete. But also you get extra power and flexibility at the low level. The later abstractions we make, they're going to build on top of them, remain compatible. You'll get a thing like a data source root node, a data, and that's the child of the data provider node. It's going to add conventions like that, but the thing that you have implemented is going to continue to be valid at the lower level XSD. So what it is your implementation is going to stay quite predictable. Perhaps just it will become advanced as the standard changes. So it's more involved maybe to do the more robust XML today. And it'll remain more robust tomorrow. So you're asking, like, should we use them today? I said if. Well, obviously my answer is yes. And I have caveats. But I think you should make them today. I think that the first thing you should do is obviously try to keep them to the admin only. There are certain conventions that are not established in the front end, even though you may see elements of the UI component architecture there. But if you're making new ones, put them in the admin like we did in our demo. And implementation concerns that you might experience, they're not architecture problems. We discussed the architecture problems and the architecture advantages. And the implementation stuff is nice and loosely coupled to it. The UI components just let you express what your views do without specifying how they do it. It's delegation. It's a beautiful thing. And it's perfect for a growing platform like Magento 2 because it's going to continue to change and we're going to continue to make changes that improve developer happiness like this. Look, we know what that takes. I'm here now, and there's other people here who, when I showed up, they shared that vision. They had that vision. That satisfying inner loop is something that is coming, and it's close. There's people doing it, actually, in their own experimental systems right now. There's somebody showed you that earlier today. We know why that's important because of, as I said, the dramatic increase in productivity and just in, like, quality of life that comes from having that immediate feedback. We know why it's important and why it both makes you money and makes your life better. And we know how to get there, I think. And we're on the right track. But we need your experiences because in order to make good higher order abstractions that apply to a lot of cases, we kind of need higher order brains. And that just means lots of people. I'm just asking you to help me. We're on our way to a great place, and I kind of, I've done this before, but the more data points we have, the more feedback we have from you guys through all the channels available to you, on GitHub, on the forums, talking directly to me, that's going to help us make those good abstractions. We hope that, now that I've kind of explained how I see as a relative newbie, UI components' intent and their architectural purpose, and the thing that they achieve, what they understand, what they reveal, and what they organize, that now that we can be aligned between the Magento core team and the vast and precious community of people who help us, then we can help each other make this thing better and better all the time. Talk to me about it. I'm here. I got, the contacts and the stuff and on Twitter for some reason. Thank you very much, guys. It's been great. What, are you leaving? Questions? One sec. All right. What do I have to pick? Go for it.
So I've played around with the UI components a little bit, and it seems like they're heavily geared toward using data from a database. If you have a UI, if you want to use a flat array, however, let's say it's coming from another source like config or something, do you have any tips or tricks on how to make that work correctly, like with the pagination, the filters, that kind of stuff?
Data sources produce deep data, is what you're saying. You'd like to kind of get it flat?
Yeah, well, no, I'm working with a data source that's not coming from a database. It's an array that's being generated on the fly.
Okay. An array is being generated on the fly.
Yeah.
And it comes in, it's loaded in through the preload. And you're saying that it comes in just in a format that, like, you don't have the flexibility inside the data source kind of XML components to specify how you want it reshaped, basically, how you want it transformed? Filters?
Yes, the way that we are coding the data right now is to override some methods in the data provider.
Okay, like so you override the data provider class, PHP, and you write the methods?
Right.
Yeah, well that's actually right now, according to the docs, what you're supposed to do, is that if you need anything that the XML configuration alone cannot provide, then you just dive right into the PHP implementation. That's the escape hatch, I guess, and so it sounds like you're doing it right.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk to you offline about this.
Yeah, maybe you should.
It's a little bit deeper than what I can describe in a little bit of time I have.
Makes sense, sure. You're gonna...
Hey.
Hey.
So you're relatively new here.
That's right.
You seem pretty passionate about the UI components, or at least you fake it properly. But what was your first and second reaction when you came in and you saw the UI components? I will tell you my reaction, but in person, I don't want to swear in front of everyone.
Oh, I understand. I was unable to distinguish it from any of the other things that I didn't understand. I'm not really, experienced with, I did a little bit of Magento 1 implementation as competitive Intel back in the day, but, I did not see how they were particularly distinct from other things. What I did see was that the tremendous inheritance graph that exists across both Magento 2 and the extension sort of all do this, that the inheritance graph can lead to a type of fragility that I think UI components, as soon as I understood what they were for, that I think they mitigate. So, I mean, the passion is there, Yeah, yeah. You want to come see if I'm real? But it's certainly mitigated, right, by the usability stuff, and I think I feel lucky that it's not horribly broken at an architectural level, and that we have to patch it with fun usability stuff or with nicely named methods. It's a lot nicer than that. So yeah, I mean, as I did an implementation, I found that I was hamstrung by some things, sure, as we all are by a lot of systems. But I think that those issues can be covered incrementally rather than having to be torn out and redone. And so I was happy to see that, for sure. But I want to know what your experience was, even if you disagree with me on a fundamental level. I want to know. I really do. Okay, great. Let's do it. Get this guy out of here. I know. It's going to be, yeah. All right. Anything else?
Over here.
Sure.
Hey, I'm Brendan. From my perspective, we have like a use case to modify the admin. One time versus 1,000 times we need to modify the front end for this kind of work. So I'm going to be the two-part question guy. One is, at what point can we see applications of UI components into the front end? And knowing that that's not quite ready today, what can we look at on the admin side?
Yeah.
Will point us in the direction of the missing holes at this point.
Okay, so I understood the first part of the question.
Like if we look at what's working in admin HTML UI components, what needs to change in them today to make them workable on the front end, and how can we learn from that to prepare for it?
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say that admin has a whole lot of JavaScript subsystem that is guaranteed to be present. There's the core app JS file, which is the coordinator that implements The root node for all the UI components is not present on the front end. So if there are existing themes that are built on top of a succession of, jQuery UI components and fun stuff, then those things would need to be dramatically refactored to be compatible with some notional future component top-down thing. That's like the first thing. So we got to approach it from the bottom up. I have worked with implementing a component architecture, specifically React.js, in a system that was based on event soup. And rather than implement a root node and then try to contain the weirdness, the right approach was always to go from the leaf nodes to make little islands of goodness and then continue to go up the tree of things. So what I think you'll see is that first of all, there's a separate initiative, which I'm not talking about here, to optimize kind of built assets and the build pipeline, and in doing so, there's a type of organization that we have to impose. And so that probably will give us some extra tooling to identify those leaf nodes that could be encapsulated as cool UI components on the front end, establish what JavaScript guarantees can be made there, and then do it. I think you'll probably find that rather than having a giant class system like the admin UI has, you might find it to be more functional, more based in the sort of scheme-like JavaScript that you see in really modern systems like I suppose like React or like Vue. So that's what's gating it, I think, is the build pipeline stuff that we're working on. And then I guess the second part of the question, you can kind of see where in the admin there are things that are UI components that are limited to a certain area. Even though there is an app, the skeleton is mostly empty in a couple of pages, and then there's just a couple of UI components there. So you'll see hints, I suppose, of what the front end would look like. I hope that helps.
Actually, I thought this guy was stealing my question, but my question is a little bit more practical. That actually.
Hear that?
So yes, when we're dealing with UI components in the back end, they're maybe really complex because they're dealing with a lot of data sets.
Right.
Compared to the front end, that they might be a lot simpler. But actually, in the front end, they are much more needed because in the back end, well, you need a grid, you need a search, you need filtering, etc. But in the front end, you need much more. So to make it more practical, actually, if the definitions of the UI components would already be extendable, so you could create your own base UI component.
Oh, so you could say this, we have a component that declares that it extends exports button or something like, a little bit like what I could have done with the container. But
so if the definitions.xml file of the UI component module could be extendable by third party.
Oh, yeah. We had a slide, I talked about that.
Yeah, so you mentioned it, and then you mentioned actually it's not there yet.
Well, I can tell you there's really cool discussion about it because I think it's a very hot item. Everyone knows, certainly in the core team that's done this, that it's a usability issue because they're really big on XSD validation and having your development environment be as helpful as possible here. Happiness. And so the idea right now, I think that I'm seeing, though it's not my area, is spontaneous and incremental auto generation of XSDs. So you would get you'd be able to do that now, and the only downside of it was the XSDs don't merge, so you can't change definitions XML, you get that error. So if you could auto-generate an XSD as a result of a file watcher that sees that you made this change, and then store it somewhere, that would be implemented as an IDE plugin or perhaps as a persistent process that you run. Or that, yeah. But I mean, but that's limited, right? Yeah. That's, you get the limits. You have to anticipate everyone's front-end needs if you make an XSD for that. So people are working on it for sure. I hope that makes sense.
For last question.
Last question.
Two last questions.
Hi, my name is Max.
Max.
So basically, it's kind of two questions. First of all,
guys, you're getting your money's worth.
Yes, 2 for 1. For the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to change architecture of UI components. And we as a developers we have to adjust and to learn new way of building functionality. What would be your it's first part of the question. What would be your recommendation for us as extension developers to follow latest practices, right? And the second one, for example, if you are guys going to report next, imagine that you completely changed whole UI components and it's brand new and we have to start learning and doing everything in a new way, new approach, right?
Yeah.
My question is, for example, if I have extension which supports Magento 2.0, 2.1, and in 2.2 or 3, there will be new way of building UI components or functionality. based on UI components. Will it be supported for older versions?
So I had a bit that kind of tried to address that. So to your first question, right now I feel that the extension developer community has a right to feel that we want to be more proactive. There aren't really many channels or avenues to learn or to see into the development cycle. So we're figuring that out. I would say as soon as we have solved what we believe to be kind of fundamental development cycle concerns, how do we, when do we release? How do we get this thing to be continuously developable because it's so important and have input, then you're going to start seeing it. It's really just like any other code, but because, as you said, it's so central to the future of what your extension developers are going to have to do, we're not going to throw open the barn doors and show you, all the weird stuff that we've experimented on and then make people panic. But what I think we will do is the dev docs are going to improve. There's going to be messaging about that. And there's like stuff lined up to push out new updates to those dev docs right now in my head. And there's also, I think, going to be more interaction in GitHub issues and in the forum that's more structured. So what I can say to your second question that I think also is a more satisfactory answer to your first is that the slide that said we're trying to build higher order abstractions and the slide that said, hey, we'll maybe put some nicer XML on top of the more flexible XML, that's the basic idea. I would say if you build something with the way that UI components work now, the new system will not have a migration path. It will not have adjustments to make. The new system is, we're going to design it, we plan to design it so that there is an additional abstraction that is optional to use, and thus it makes what you built your extension in just a lower level but still accessible part of the API. So yeah, it's going to be backwards compatible in as much as anything is. If you touch the database and you do it wrong in 2.0, then that's not a UI component concern. But the components are supposed to be every successive API, every successive interface that we release to them, we do it slowly and carefully because we know that it's a commitment and that further things have to build upon them. And maybe why it's slow. That was the last questions, right? But you guys want to just kind of scrum up here and let things pass? I guess, what time is it? I want to talk to people, but I think we're done, right? Yeah, okay. So let's, I'll be up here.